Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you as we continue working through the book of Samuel, Samuel chapters 25 and 26. We are going to be looking at David on the Run, part 3, as he's been traveling through the wilderness, hunted down by Saul. We're going to see a couple of different stories today, one of which involves Saul, and one of which actually just kind of details for us a little bit more about David and his family, about where his family really comes from. Specifically kind of his line of descendants from him. And so we're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. It is interesting to note here, Samuel is the last person in the Old Testament who we see described as all Israel assembles and mourns for him. Not even King David will have all of Israel assemble and mourn for him. And we talked about this a little bit during our G3 study. And we suggested that maybe part of that is that David is a man of war. David is a king from the tribe of Judah, perhaps maybe the tribe of Benjamin, that was Saul's tribe, still felt a little slighted at his death. We're not really sure why. Perhaps it's just really to try to emphasize Samuel and his faithful service to the Lord. This was a man who really bridged that gap between judges and the time of the kings. He was a faithful prophet, a faithful priest, a faithful leader, a forerunner of our prophet, priest, and king. And so certainly I think as we see him, we should take this time too to recognize him and the faithful service that he provided for God's people as recorded for us in the book of 1 Samuel. Moving on then, kind of the second half of verse 1. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Peran. There are some textual variants here. Some people suggest that it is Maon, the wilderness of Maon, that he goes to instead of the wilderness of Peran. The wilderness of Peran is down here basically at the southernmost portion of the nation of Israel. Kadesh Barnea is the southernmost city in Israel. It really never expands too much further south than that. And part of it is there's really nothing for it to expand to. Everything past Kadesh Barnea is just utter wilderness. But perhaps why we'll see some scribes may have tried to switch it to Maon instead of Peran. Maon is up here just 7 or 8 miles south of Hebron and just to the west of the Dead Sea. And the next story, the story that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on actually in 1 Samuel 25, takes place in that wilderness. And there's no description of the journey up. But we don't need to be concerned by that. Certainly we can see David having gone down to the wilderness of Peran, and then without a need for God to tell us clearly, he's moved up to the wilderness of Maon. He's moved back kind of north in Judea. As we think about that wilderness of Peran, I do think it's really interesting to hear. If we look at Psalm 63, I'm pulling that up right now. Psalm 63 is described as David writing this while he's in the wilderness of Judah. And this is potentially a time where he wrote this while he was in this wilderness of Peran. You can see it on your screen. Certainly barren, dry, arid, not a whole lot of vegetation, not a whole lot of life, a difficult place to survive. This is certainly a possibility. Another possibility is that while he's on the run from Absalom, his son, we'll get into that in 2 Samuel. We'll read about this account, how David has to flee again into the wilderness from his very own son. But this psalm gets written while he's in the wilderness of Judah, potentially this very wilderness that we're looking at. And I want you to hear just how faithful David is, even in the midst of the wilderness. How he takes his surroundings and he transforms them to tell people about God. And so let's hear this. This is Psalm 63. David writes, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." Certainly David's taking his surroundings and he's saying, look, my soul thirsts for you like the land around me thirsts for water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. It could be easy, I think, in the midst of persecution while you're wandering in the wilderness to think, well, God doesn't have my best interest in mind. I can't trust this God. And yet David here says, no, I'm going to bless you as long as I live. In your name, I will lift up my hands. You're better than life. You are steadfast in your love, even if it sometimes seems like that's not the case. David writes in verse 5, my soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. You'll notice the only shadows to be found in this land are basically when the sun is either rising or setting, to be on the right side of a hill. There's no trees, there's no shade, and yet David reminds himself that his shade is the Lord, that he is under the shadow of the Lord's wings. My soul clings to you, David writes, your right hand upholds me, but those who seek to destroy my life shall go down into the depths of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword, they shall be a portion for jackals. But the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. So David says, yes, I have enemies. Yes, there are real threats in my life. But Lord, I know the end game. I know that you will care for me, that you will defeat my enemies, that I will be able to sing your praises now and forever. Certainly beautiful words from David, words that really do, I think, capture just his faithfulness, even in the midst of the wilderness. Words that I think we should aspire to, because frankly, we're probably not in quite as severe a wilderness as our brother David was. But even if we are, we have his example, his words, his wisdom to lead us through the wilderness as well. Anyway, back to 1 Samuel 25, verse 2. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. And so again, as we look at this map, we've moved back into the north. Hebron is here. The Dead Sea is just off the screen to the east here. Carmel and Maon are these two kind of neighboring villages right here in the wilderness of Maon, just to the south of Hebron. And we hear about a man who is very rich. And it's interesting, we don't have access to his name right off the bat. We start out just with his wealth. This is probably not a good sign. Certainly meant to be kind of offensive, I think, to this man, and we'll see why shortly. Now, verse 3, the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. And now actually, as he's finally introduced, his name is Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail, we actually see something of a chiasm here. And that's a fancy way of saying this was kind of a pretty typical practice in Hebrew literature, where you would start with kind of the first description of something. So your A line, so to speak, if you're talking about kind of poetry. A is a description of Nabal. Then you go to B, a description of Abigail. You get their names there. Then another B, a description of Abigail as discerning and beautiful. She is highly thought of. And then the chiasm, an A, Nabal, on the other hand, is harsh and badly behaved. And so this little chiasm, this little poetic device here is lifting up Abigail and saying, hey, she's really great. And it's putting down Nabal and saying, yeah, and he's kind of miserable. And he's a Calebite. So if you can think back to our discussions on Joshua or Judges, Caleb was a faithful Israelite, one of the two spies that brings back a good report when he's sent into the promised land. It's Caleb and Joshua. Those are the only two that bring back a good report. The other 10 are scared and convince the people that they should be scared too. Caleb says, nope, we got this. God's got this. And then he and Joshua are the only two that get to go into the promised land from that group. And he, even as an 80-year-old guy, a guy, frankly, probably no longer in the prime of his life, helps deliver Israel from the hands of powerful enemies because God is with him. And so Nabal then is being depicted as kind of the anti-Caleb here. He's a Calebite. He's descended from Caleb. He should be faithful. And yet he's not. He's harsh and badly behaved. Now David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David set 10 young men. And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have." So this is very formulaic. David is sending these 10 men kind of as his ambassadors, as his deputies. And they're supposed to speak formulaically. They're supposed to give honor to Nabal. They're supposed to honor him through their words and their actions. Verse 7, "I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have in your hand to your servants and to your son David." And so David is sending this kind of delegation, these ambassadors, with the purpose of obtaining supplies for the feast day. We're not sure what feast day it is. Nabal is shearing sheep here, and so David is actually catching him at a really good time for a herdsman. Obviously, as he's shearing the sheep, he's going to sell that wool, he's going to sell those materials, and he's going to be able to recoup a large sum of money for this. This is when he's at his wealthiest. And so out of his abundance, David is asking for supplies for him and his men. And he's saying, look, we've basically been doing a service to you. We've been watching over your shepherds, over your sheep in the wilderness. We haven't touched them, we haven't hurt them, we've guarded and protected them. Can you return the favor? Verse 9, "When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?'" And so this harsh and frankly kind of worthless individual hears from David, and he mocks David in response. Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? He basically says, this guy's a nobody. Why on earth would I care for him? He's no one. And now, of course, he does actually know who David is, and he says it even. There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. He knows that David is on the run from Saul. And in fact, here he probably is breaking the 8th commandment by saying, oh, you're just abandoning your master. I've heard the whole story. I know all the details. I know all the dirt. You're just a worthless servant. That's why you're on the run. And furthermore, look at verse 11. Notice where Nabal's heart is at. Shall I take my bread, my water, my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who I'm not even sure where they come from? Notice how many my's there are. There are 4 distinct. This is my stuff. And maybe this is tempting for us sometimes to think about our houses or our cars, things that have our names on the title, things that we own, and to think of them as ours. But what a helpful reminder I think this story is that nothing is ours. That everything we have is a gift from God, is something that comes from our Creator. Nabal does not think this way, obviously, and again, he even insults the people who are there, the delegation. Give it to men who come from I do not know where. He's basically saying, look, you guys are those worthless individuals. Remember, the people that come out to David aren't the mighty men, the warriors. They're the ones who are in debt, the ones who are in need, the ones who are ill-contented with the way things are in the world. So I think even here we see him taking a shot at these people saying, I don't know where you're from. You guys are kind of the low end of the totem pole. Why would I give my stuff to you? And to their credit, David's young men acting as ambassadors do not respond. They don't take the bait. They don't start a fight. They go back to their master. So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. I'm sure bringing these insults along with them. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. And as this is happening, we are basically picturing Nabal is going to die. This is a death sentence that David is uttering here as he gathers 400 of his troops, swords in hand, and says, we're going after Nabal. I will not stand for this kind of abuse from such a man as this. We're going after him. Certainly, as we see this, then, we're meant to picture the worst for Nabal and his household. But something is going to take place here. One of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep." And so we hear from this messenger, this kind of servant of Nabal, that, hey, everything that David's men are saying is true. I can back it up. They actually were even more helpful than he said. They were like a wall to us. I immediately draw to mind the image of Jesus talking about the sheep pen, right? That's what David and his men are for Nabal's sheep, for the shepherds. They are the pen, the walls that guard them, that keep out the wicked, that keep out people that would potentially want to hurt them, that keep out animals that would want to hurt them. David and his men are protecting Nabal's flock. And he says, look, they treated us super well. So now therefore know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. And so we see here the servant basically says, look, I can't talk to our master about this. He's not going to respond. He's worthless. That worthless word is actually the same word used to describe Samuel's sons earlier in the book, to basically say that they were totally unfaithful priests that did not know the Lord. And so perhaps this term worthless here is also indicating that Nabal does not know the Lord, that he is not a follower of Yahweh, that he's worthless. He is not a true child of Israel here. But then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. In terms of how much food and drink this is, we talked about this a little bit in G3. My guess is that the wine is specifically for David. 2 skins of wine is probably not going to be enough to provide for 600 troops, at least in my understanding of what a skin is. But in terms of the food then, there should be enough food basically for this feast. Abigail isn't supplying them with a great amount, but she is providing them with enough to celebrate this feast together. And that is meaningful. It expresses generosity, it expresses her goodness, it expresses her wisdom as she seeks to kind of save her household from this coming disaster. Verse 19, and she said to her young men, "Go on before me, behold, I come after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. I can only imagine actually this scene, at least to a degree. Abigail is carrying this food. You can see it depicted in this image here, is having this food brought out. She's trying to hurry and get to David before disaster strikes. And as she's coming around the mountain, behold, she runs into David, sword in hand, his men, his army also garbed for war. I'd have to think that there's some level of fear there, and yet Abigail's response is so faithful throughout this. It is truly a testament to her character. Verse 21, now David had said, "Surely in vain I have guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." So David basically says, I'm out for blood. I'm coming and I'm going to kill this wicked man who has repaid me evil for good. I took care of him. I took care of his stuff. I took care of his sheep, his shepherds. And now what? Now he insults me and sends me away with nothing. That's it. I've had enough. And so he takes an oath even and says, God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning even one male of his household is alive. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. So she's offering up homage to David. She's acknowledging his greatness, his position, perhaps even his anointment as king. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant." Notice how she takes the guilt. This is not her guilt. This is not her sin. And yet she willingly takes Nabal's guilt upon herself and says, "This is on me. Listen to me now. Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." What Abigail is doing here is she's playing off of Nabal's name. Nabal in Hebrew has a couple of different meanings, and the most common one is simply foolish or fool. In the original Hebrew text, you wouldn't have found vowels, so you would have just seen these letters. These are all consonants. This makes kind of the N sound, the B sound, the L sound, a nun, beit, lamed. But as we look at what they would do, they would supply the vowel as they read it underneath. And so different vowels would appear underneath these letters, and you would utter those vowels, and that would indicate what you were reading. So depending on what vowels are under there, this 3 kind of letter root can mean foolish. And so Abigail basically says, look, Nabal is his name. He's a fool. Now, of course, I don't know many parents that would blatantly name their child fool. So Nabal probably comes from a different root, at least his name does. It could be from something that means noble, ironically the same 3-letter root that we do. There's no relation there, trust me. Very few Hebrew words have made their way into English. It could also be something like nebel, which refers to the opening of a bottle. And certainly, actually, the author of 1 Samuel will make a play on that word, too. We'll later find out that Nabal is a drunkard. But Abigail is basically saying to David, look, you can't take Nabal seriously. Look at his name. He's a fool. There's nothing we can do about it. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. So again, Abigail's taking the blame and saying, look, I didn't see them. I would have taken care of them. Disregard the folly of this fool, of this Nabal. It's all good. Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal. She basically says, look, I know you're going to be merciful. I know you're not going to treat him with the punishment he deserves. And so let all of your enemies who seek evil to you be as Nabal. Let them all be foolish. Let them all not be a serious threat to you. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. Again, she's placing that trespass upon herself. For the Lord will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. And evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. Again, she's really offering up some good flattering here, reminding David of all the battles he has fought for the Lord, saying he's going to make you a sure house. The security, the certainty of David's future is rooted in his trust in the Lord. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. Here she's probably directly drawing his attention back to that great famous fight with Goliath, with the Philistine. She's basically saying, look, all of your enemies are going to be like a stone in a sling. You'll be able to just flick it and they'll be away from you. There's no worry. You have no fears. The Lord is with you. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, once you sit on the throne as God has promised, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. And so she says, look, God's going to sit you on the throne, and I don't want you to have this blood guilt on your head. I don't want you to have to think to yourself, man, did I maybe cross a line here? Did I maybe shed blood that I didn't need to shed? Did I take my salvation into my own hands, my vengeance, my wrath? And of course, it's interesting. This is directly tying to what David had said to Saul just last chapter in 1 Samuel 24. David had basically said to Saul, look, I'm not going to kill you because the Lord is the one who takes vengeance. And you can think about Romans 12 here as well. Paul says a similar thing. We talked about that last week as well. And yet here in this moment, he's forgotten this promise. And maybe it's just because it's just one more person, one more, it's that proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Maybe the insults here were just a little bit too much for David and his pride. Perhaps there is sin behind his actions here. And yet Abigail is trying to get him to stop, to slow down. And she says, and when everything works out for you, remember me. Remember your servant well. And David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to me. David says, blessed be God for this, for your service to me, for your wisdom. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. He says, look, you're right. I was going to go do this with my own, but that's not what I've been called to do. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. David says, look, I was going to come out and I was going to kill Nabal. I was going to kill his household, all the males in his house. So then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition. We see David's wisdom here in accepting good counsel. He gets this good counsel from Abigail, and he tells her, in peace, return to your house. I've heard you. I have listened to you. I will not strike. I will let the Lord take care of my battles for me. Verse 36, and Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. Isn't it interesting here that Nabal, this worthless man, this harsh, cruel man, is feasting like a king while the true king of Israel sits in a cave somewhere in the wilderness? Nabal had plenty, he had excess, he is feasting like a king, but had nothing to give to the true king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. And as we see this here, actually there's that nebel word, that word for bottle, it's being used in this section as it talks about him being drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. We're not sure whether this is referencing like a seizure of some sort of physical ailment that comes upon him because of his fear, his terror. We're not sure if it's just he is so upset with his wife for going behind his back, even though we would say that she did actually faithfully submit to her husband here. She has not abandoned him. She has instead sought out his safekeeping and has not broken any of his commands, as we think about kind of Paul's depiction of what a husband and wife should look like in marriage. And he's just kind of catatonic. He's just so upset that he's not even talking. But whatever the reason, 38, about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. David's faith, Abigail's good counsel, we see it come to fruition. Verse 39, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. So David basically says, look, Nabal got what he deserved. He was a sinner, he wronged me, and I was going to be the one to kill him, but I didn't have to, because God has my back. God provided for me. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife. And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. So again, we see Abigail's humility here. It is interesting to note, typically there was a mourning period, a grieving period for widows. It does not appear that Abigail is really holding to that at this point. which maybe again speaks to the situation, just how harsh Nabal was, just how worthless he was in comparison to David, this man after God's own heart. Perhaps we can see why Abigail is so willing to make this jump pretty much immediately after she enters into widowhood. But notice there too, she's not going to have to wash the feet of the servants of David. This is, again, just though expressing her willingness to serve her husband, to serve David as her king, as her husband. And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. Now David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galim. And so we see here that Saul again has kind of slighted David. Earlier he gave away his oldest daughter to someone, really to just try to get at David. And now we see he's giving Michal, who was David's wife, away. Which, what a miserable way to treat your daughters, to see them just as collateral to be used in this battle against David. What a shame it is that we see Saul acting in this way. Also of note, I try to bring this up pretty much any time there's issues of polygamy in the Old Testament. For whatever reason, God doesn't firmly speak against it, despite it appearing in the lives of numerous of faithful people. It happens with Abraham, it happens with Jacob, it happens with David, with Solomon. And it doesn't seem to reflect the image of marriage that God lays out for us in Genesis, that image of one man, one woman. And yet, I think as we look at the outcomes of this polygamy, as we look at the outcomes of what happens when God's people engage in this behavior, it always ends poorly. For all of his success, for all of his goodness, David's family is a total mess. And we'll see that as we get into 2 Samuel. And I think this, in large part, has to do with this aspect of it. This is not how God intended his people to live. And when we live this way, sin can't help but take root. Sin can't help but be an active part of our lives. And so I think we do need to consider that, and I think we see that reflected in the lives of God's people. They sinned, I think, in doing this, even if God doesn't directly call it as such, and we see that in the fruits of this behavior. Moving on to 1 Samuel 26, then we're just going to try to get through one more chapter. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Yeshimon?" And so we see a very similar occurrence to what we saw in 1 Samuel 24. David is in this wilderness of Maon. This whole area is kind of that wilderness, this wilderness of Ziph. And as he's hiding at Hachilah, the Ziphites, who probably were somewhat nomadic, they maybe had this base camp, but I'm sure a number of them were herdsmen that kind of used these hills and went where they could find what little grass and vegetation there was for their livestock. They go to Saul and Gibeah and say, "Hey, we know where David is. He's at Hachilah. Come down." So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hachilah, which is beside the road on the east of Yeshimon. So Saul comes right over to where David is, and he parks down with his 3,000 troops. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed come. So he hears that Saul himself is down here. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay with Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was lying within the encampment while the army was encamped around him. So we're basically picturing really just any medieval campsite that you can picture in a movie. This is what we're seeing. Saul's in the middle of the camp, closest to his generals, so that the rest of the army is protecting them. So that way they're protected from any potential incursions. Saul's safely in the middle, safely away from any potential harm. But, verse 6, then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, "Who will go down with me into the camp to Saul?" And Abishai said, "I will go down with you." So David and Abishai went to the army by night. And there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground in his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. So David and Abishai sneak into this camp. We're definitely picturing those covert operations, right? They're working their way through the darkness, quietly winding their way through Saul's troops, getting closer and closer to Saul in the middle of the camp. And there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice. Abishai basically says, look, your enemy is before you again. Let me do it. It will be a mercy to Saul. And that's really what he's saying. I'll only need one stroke. I'll make it quick. I'll make it painless. Saul will wake up and he'll be at the pearly gates, right? He'll have no idea what happened. There will be no issues. You will be victorious. You will be able to sit on your throne. And perhaps again we hear that wisdom of Abigail said through David here. He's now said this, or to an effect, this 3 chapters in a row. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. So David says, look, I can't do this. I can't put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. We cannot kill him. This is not right. This would make us guilty. Let him be. God will take care of me. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. So David says, let's just take 2 symbols again to show that we did this. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. And so where once we were maybe picturing this really covert operation, like guards patrolling the camp, David and Abishai diving into the shadows behind a tent to make sure they're not caught, that quiet whispering, the hand signals, all of it. We now hear God's direct agency in this. God has caused a deep sleep to fall about the camp so that David again might be proven blameless, that we might see his righteousness, his example. Verse 13, then David went over to the other side and stood far off on the top of the hill with a great space between them. And David called to the army and to Abner the son of Ner, saying, will you not answer, Abner? Then Abner answered, who are you who calls to the king? And I can only imagine that as Abner wakes up, it's one of those, oh my goodness, what happened while I was asleep moments. It's the moment that I have when maybe I doze off in the morning after getting up with my kids and wake up 15 minutes later and they're nowhere in sight and wonder what kind of trouble have they found themselves in, right? Abner wakes up and he knows this is not good. And David calls him on it. David said to Abner, verse 15, are you not a man who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. He says, look, why weren't you doing your job to protect the Lord's anointed? Someone could have gotten hurt. Someone really could have killed him. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed. And with every word, Abner's got to just be going pale, right? Oh no, what has happened? And now see where the king's spear is and the jar of water that was at his head. And that's got to be the straw that breaks the camel's back right there. Abner's just got to be like, I cannot believe this happened. The shame, the dishonor. Oh, how could we fall asleep on the job like this? 17, Saul recognized David's voice and said, is this your voice, my son David? And David said, it is my voice, my lord, O king. Again, notice David's faithfulness. Notice that David is saying Saul is still the king, which is true. And he said, why does my lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now, therefore, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. He's talking here about, hey, look, if I've made a mistake, if I've done something, if I've sinned against you, then let me make a sacrifice. Let's make it right. But if you're just doing this because men are telling you to, because you feel threatened by me in some way, shape, or form, then let them be cursed, because right now, I don't even get to worship the way I want to. I'm in exile. Now, therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to sink a single flea like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains. And so he's saying, look, I'm nothing. You're hunting after me, but I'm nothing. Stop worrying about me. I'm not going to do anything. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake. And David answered and said, Here is the spear, O king. Let one of your young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord. And may he deliver me out of all tribulation. Then Saul said to David, Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them. So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. Notice again, we do see David's wisdom, David's cunning here. Saul invites David back to the palace and says, Come back and serve, but David goes his own way. He knows that until Saul is dead, there will never be true peace between them, that Saul will continue to give way to this sin, this temptation. This is actually the last time that we see them interacting in the book of Samuel. And so maybe they did end on not horrific terms, at least. Certainly we see Saul acknowledging that David will be king, that he will be blessed. But again, the highlight of this story is David's service, David's willingness to trust in God for deliverance. And certainly, as we think about our own sins, our own failings, our own struggles, we should be turning to the same place, to Christ and his sacrifice, to what God has promised that he will do in our lives. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord God Almighty, we thank you for this opportunity to gather in your word, to be reminded of your servant David and his faithfulness. Lord, we pray that, like David, you would help us not to seek out our own vengeance, not to seek out our own good, but to seek out the good of others. Help us to not be like Nabal, foolish and angry and filled with rage and hate, but help us instead to have wisdom like Abigail and David, wisdom to accept good counsel, and wisdom that gives good counsel, that points people to Christ and him crucified, to the great gifts that are ours in his death and resurrection. Lord, we ask this all in your Son's most precious and holy name. Amen. Well, thank you for being with me again today, and we'll continue with 1 Samuel next time. Thanks. Have a nice day.